Hey there, and welcome to another painting video tutorial. My name is Matt, and in this video I'm going to show you how I complete a painting. You've seen in the past 2 weeks how I design and block in a painting, as well as how I complete the sculpture phase, where I create the illusion of form and light. Now it's time to break out the small brushes and get detailed with the last phase of my painting process, the detail phase. Sit back, relax, and let's get into it. First things first, I shape the mountains a bit better and clean up some of the edges. I find that as I move forward, the colors in this hill on the left are still not quite where I want them, so I go in with a lighter tone and blue these areas out to make them appear further away. As I'm doing this, I'm using a bit less yellow ochre and a bit more cobalt teal in those highlights to bring down the contrast between highlights and shadows. Other than color though, I'm using about the same technique now as I did in the sculpture phase. I'm pretty happy with the level of detail here, so I just alter those colors slightly and move on to detailing the big pine tree in the center. I go in first with a very dark tone, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and a touch of phthalo green, and mark in the shadows on the underside of the branches. Then I come behind that with a bright yellow color, yellow ochre, cadmium lemon, and ultramarine blue to mark in the highlights. As you can see, I'm trying to create a sharp light on the right side of the tree, so my highlights are a bit dimmer on the left side and I pack more contrast into the needles on the right. Then I go in with a mixture of titanium white and yellow ochre to give a sharp highlight on the trunk of the tree peeking through the needles. Moving forward, I make notes on the bushes to deepen the tone that I can then highlight over. I'm using the same shadow color here as I did on the tree and marking sporadically with a 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush. I add some phthalo green and cadmium lemon to the mix and mark in a mid-tone with the same brush, and then I go in with a dull highlight and blend down into the shadows. Lastly, with a small synthetic liner brush, I go in and paint clumps of leaves where I think the highlight should go on the bush. Moving to the center bushes, I follow the same process, shadows first, followed by midtones and sharper highlights. As I move left along this line of bushes, I'm moving further into the background, so as I'm mixing my color, I create zones of less contrast as the subject gets further and further away from the viewer. Detailing the grass alone in this painting took over 25 hours, and I learned quite a bit throughout the process. I had never really painted grass like this before, but the process for my grass ended up following about the same as any other foliage I've done so far. Shadows first, then midtones and highlights. After detailing the grass on the right, I move to the path. As it fades into the distance, less detail shows through, so I go in first with speckled dirt achieved with burnt umber on a trimmed fan brush, and then I load up my dagger with a highlight color and work that in over the shadows. As the path moves forward, I want to continue the illusion of powerful light, so I decide to paint the shadows for individual blades of this grass patch on the right of the path. After painting the shadows in, I follow that with some highlights that dig into the baseline of the shadow to create more complexity. Then it's time to detail the rocks on the left. Here in the shadows, I'm deepening the tone with a blue-gray to represent ambient, reflected light bouncing off the shapes in the shadows. Then I go in over that with a warm highlight, making sure to keep that highlight paint thick to add more structure. And lastly, it's time for the grass on the left. As I move forward, I'm able to use bigger brushes to imitate that grassy texture. So I paint in a dark midtone with a trimmed fan brush, then add my shadows and midtones over that with an ivory dagger. Here, I'm keeping my shadow blades long and relatively straight. Then when it's time to add highlights, I start to give the grass some character. And here I am using a sable rigger brush to paint on the short, curved highlights to give the illusion of that tall grass. Following that same process, I detail the bottom left patch of grass. Here I'm using a slightly bigger ivory dagger for the shadows, creating a bit of complexity with the direction of the shadow and mid-tone blades. However, they are still primarily straight up and down. Close up on a patch of grass like this, it's important to keep your highlights short and not to add too many. So I go in with my first pass of highlights and add curved marks to this patch, and then with my sharpest highlights, almost pure titanium white and cadmium lemon, I work in some little curved marks to finish off the detail in the grass. 78 hours of work went into this piece, and I'm so happy with how it turned out. Let's take a look at a time lapse of the detail phase to see this thing come to life. That is all for this time. Thanks so much for watching this week's video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos coming to you weekly. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook or through my website, www.artofmatthewkent.com. All of those links are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and happy painting.